Hello, and welcome to our online lecture. I'm here to talk to you today about the interwar years. So, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the events that start the First World War and look at how global issues as well as local problems are redefining government, public health, and its relationship to who is counted and who is not in the first couple decades of the 20th century. I want to focus on, I actually need to, I recently updated this lecture due to global, unprecedented global actions. So I apologize for changing the title. I'm not focused so much on the weapons part as we're going to be looking at other things such as the federal government. And I'm doing this so we can really have a point of comparison between the 1920s as now and today, as we are seeing unprecedented events unfold before our eyes, and a government that in many ways is reminiscent of the government right before Roosevelt and the New Deal and the Second World War. So I really want to try to put some of these events into historical perspective, as that is one of the few ways that I can help you during this time of unprecedented crisis. So let's look at some of this. And as I said, I might need to change this as time goes on, as we are learning under emergency rather than perhaps other circumstances. So when we look at how these two world wars and sort of the establishment of global interaction of the 20th century, it's going to have a profound impact on the way that people live in ways that are just transformable. We do not have time to look at all of the many causes of the First World War. And your Zen textbook's going to do a fairly good job of talking about that as well. I like to focus on long-term causes. And long-term causes are things that are going on for decades, leading to the creation of wars. Remember, wars don't just break out of nowhere. They are strategies, long-term strategies in the making. Wars also require public support. And the First World War, from the American perspective, is highly unpopular. So the U.S. government is going to have to do a number of things to get the U.S. people on board. One of the things it does is it uses the draft. Anyway, we got to get there. Long-term causes of World War I, of course, are how countries are industrializing, right? Becoming factory-based, urban-based, concentrations of people. People are no longer are farming in record numbers. They are working for other people. So this is one of the long-term effects, right? If you can make weapons and you can make the tens of thousands of them, there is the sort of psychological idea that you're going to use them. So industrialization and weapons production becomes one of the causes of this war. Imperialism, how Western European countries as well as the United States are claiming territories across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific as their own colonies. Clearly, this creates a problem with the local people, but also these countries are also bumping up against each other for global supremacy. The scramble for Africa in the 1880s, fights over China and access to Asia are creating conditions where these countries are creating alliances with each other and creating enemies. You also have governments much more willing to use these weapons to protect their territories. So these things are very much working together. In 1914, there is an assassination in Europe of a low-level aristocrat. But that assassination becomes the justification to start a war that had been brewing for decades. The U.S. takes a position of neutrality. basically saying we're not going to get involved in the war, but we will sell weapons to anyone that needs them. So the US goes into production of chemicals, of weapons, and many of these factories are actually located in the American South, which is significant because the American South is heavily segregated and it's also very heavily socially controlled by Jim Crow. U.S. involvement in the war itself begins by 1917, and the U.S. is forced to take action as they receive a telegram basically saying that um, the government that Mexico plans to invade the United States. Again, there had been obviously ongoing wars over border disputes between the United States and Mexico for decades. Um, So the US uses this basically as an excuse to say if we don't wage war now, we will get invaded. And there is a close cooperation between Mexico and Germany, and we've got to move. And again, if you're going to make that argument, you've got to use propaganda, such as songs, posters. There's no TV yet, but it is using the newspapers, anything that can get people behind the war. It's coming at a time where the US is involved in massive labor strikes. So there's also the idea, right, that one way that you can get labor back to work is to draft them. So that becomes part of this narrative. I'm not going to, again, go into all the causes of the war. This is a whole class into itself. Um, but the phrase, the U.S. has to make the world safe for democracy, will be used again in World War II and really becomes a rallying cry for people to get behind the U.S. effort in the war, which doesn't last very long. Compared to other places in Europe that had been at war for years, the U.S. is really only involved in this war for a year. It gets involved in 1917. The war is over by 1918. Now, the impacts of the war itself are not absorbed in the United States the way they are in other places. None of the wars fought in the United States. No bridges are burned, towns are not destroyed, by warfare at least. So the U.S. is going to absorb the changes brought by the war in different ways. But what you do see in the United States compared to other parts of the world is that white mobs begin to attack African American communities. Lynchings are involved, but more than that, there is the utter destruction of black wealth going on by white terrorists, neighborhood after neighborhood throughout the 1920s. So the summer of 1919 was known as Red Summer. And I don't know how this wasn't on here, but let's put it on here. Because of all of this, this may be something that you definitely want to learn more about, as professors at Atlanta University are writing in response to this and are creating art as a response to this as well. But there's an unprecedented number of lynchings that are also taking place on and to black men who were in their service uniforms. So one way that we see change in the United States is really an uptick in racial violence. Now, where is that coming from? It potentially is coming from when white men and black men are both drafted and come home. Many of these jobs that they worked at are now being done, some by African Americans, some by women. There is a lack of job opportunity for veterans. Veterans are also, just like they had been in other previous wars, promised monies that they haven't received. Or it could be whites psychologically, again, just can't seem to wrestle with black success. There are a number of ways you might look at these attacks from the economic, social, and certainly psychological point of view. However, nonetheless, there is an outbreak of this going on in 1919. Speaking of outbreaks, there is the arrival of a global flu pandemic in 1918. Now it's called the Spanish flu because that's the region it emerged out of. You can call it the Great Flu of 1918. You can call it the pandemic of 1918. That's typically more understood. But it is a pandemic, right? of flu that is happening all over the world. And instead of picking one picture, I chose this visual display. Now, one of the things that we can parallel this global flu of 1918 to in terms of what we are experiencing now is upon arrival, the US government, federal government, right, does not have a response to this. Um, it operated under a very strict capitalist model as it currently is. Um, Leaving cities, states, to scramble to figure out how to do this on their own. Now, in the 1920s, there had never been the example of preparedness the way that there is now. In our contemporary example of the Trump administration, they have closed, they have, no, no, uh, closed business, excuse me,